to have the
Delia
opportunity
Gallagher
to
from
ask.
CNN. Cardinal O'Malley, Cardinal Subich. In 2002, the U.S. cardinals, your brother cardinals, were over here under John Paul II. I was here, many of the people in this room were here, and the American people were watching on television. And at that time, the reassuring face of this crisis, that crisis and the continuing crisis, was Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. On Saturday, dismissed from the priesthood, and was an abuser himself, talking about zero tolerance, talking about cover-up would never happen again in the United States. How do you, amongst yourselves, cardinals, how are you holding each other accountable outside of the norms now? And how do you ensure the American people that what happened with your brother cardinals in 2002 is now going to change? In other words, that they can believe what you're now saying. Thank you.
You want to start?
Well, the only thing that I can tell you, I wasn't, of course, there in 2002 as one of the cardinals. I think I'm the junior of all the cardinals in the United States, is that I and everyone else has to be held accountable, and I've always believed that. I think that I've lived my life in such a way that I take seriously my call to discipleship, my call, first of all, to be a baptized person before I'm ordained. So it's just a matter of, first of all, accountability on my part, that I'm going to live my life this way.
Since the start of the Bishops' Summit, that was obviously more about optics than addressing the abuse crisis, the mainstream secular media has gotten into the game of reporting about child abuse cases going back several years, many of them in Argentina. Obviously, that signifies that the media's love of Pope Francis has come to an end. How tragic. I'm going to show you a couple of those stories here, the first of which isn't exactly a news story by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, as Christine Niles of Church Militant pointed out with this first story, Church Militant reported on this story last year, as did the Catholic News Agency. Still, let's have a look at our first story. It's a doozy. So this story comes from Jeff Bezos' blog, The Washington Post. The Pope ignored them. Alleged abuse of deaf children on 2 continents points to Vatican failings. Argentina, of course. When investigators swept in and raided the religious Antonio Provolo Institute for the Deaf, they uncovered one of the worst cases yet among the global abuse scandals plaguing the Catholic Church. A place of silent torment where prosecutors say pedophiles preyed on the most isolated and submissive children. The scope of the alleged abuse was vast. Charges are pending against 13 suspects. A 14th person pled guilty to sexual abuse, including rape, and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The case of the accused ringleader, an octogenarian and Italian priest named Nicola Carati, is set to go before a judge next month. Carati was the spiritual director of the school and had a decades-long career spanning 2 continents. And so his arrest in late 2016 raised an immediate question. Did the Catholic Church have any sense that he could be a danger to children? The answer, according to a Washington Post investigation that included a review of court and church documents, private letters, and dozens of interviews in Argentina and Italy, is that church officials up to and including Pope Francis were warned repeatedly and directly about a group of alleged predators that included Carati, yet they took no apparent action against him. I want Pope Francis to come here. I want him to explain how this happened, how they knew this and did nothing, a 24-year-old alumna of the Provolo Institute said using sign language as her hands shook in rage. She and her 22-year-old brother, who requested anonymity to share their experiences as minors, are among at least 14 former students who say they were victims of abuse at the now shuttered boarding school in the shadow of the Andes. Vulnerable to the extreme, the deaf students tended to come from poor families that fervently believed in the sanctity of the church. Prosecutors say the children were fondled, raped, sometimes tied up, and, in one instance, forced to wear a diaper to hide the bleeding. All the while, their limited ability to communicate complicated the ability to tell others what was happening to them. Students at the school were smacked if they used sign language. One of the few hand gestures used by the priests, victims say, was an index finger to lips, a demand for silence. They were the perfect victims, said Gustavo Stropiano, the chief prosecutor in the case. Yet they may not have been the first. Karate, now 83, under house arrest, is also under investigation for sexual crimes at a sister school in Argentina, where he worked from 1970 to 1994. And alumna of a related school in Italy, where Karate served earlier, identified him as being among a number of priests who carried out systematic abuse over 5 decades. The schools were all founded and staffed by priests from the Company of Mary for the Education of the Deaf, a small Catholic community congregation that answers to the Vatican. The Italian victims' efforts to sound the alarm to church authorities began in 2008 and included mailing a list of accused priests to Francis in 2014 and physically handing him the list in 2015. As an aside, that should sound familiar and echo of the accusations made by Vigano. It was not the church, however, but Argentine law enforcement that cut off Karate's access to children when it shut down the Provolo school in Luan. Argentine prosecutors say the church has not fully cooperated with their investigation. Of course they haven't. As Francis prepares to host a historic bishop summit this week, so this article is a few days old, to address clerical sex abuse, the lapses in the case affecting the Pope's home country of Argentina and the home country of the Roman Catholic Church, illustrate the still present failures of the Church to fix a system that has allowed priests to continue to abuse children long after they were accused. If you want to read the rest of that for yourself, you can read that on the Washington Post website. A link is on the sources blog below. Yes, another spiritually uplifting story to report on. It's also tiresome. The priest in this story, Father Nicola Carati, is a member of the Company of Mary, an Italian religious community which runs schools for deaf children in numerous countries, including Argentina and Italy. Now, before we go further, that means this story has an international angle to it, which cannot be ignored. Obviously, the shuttling around of a known sex offender internationally is a crime, just as it is a crime to shuttle predator priests between states in the United States. That having been said, the role of the Vatican in approving priest transfers for religious orders is minimal, if non-existent. Still, this story gets interesting because, as the Washington Post article points out, Pope Francis had to know about Father Carati's crimes. I'm going to use a lengthy quote from a Catholic news agency article from last year, which can be found on returntotradition.org if you want to read it for yourself. A link to returntotradition.org is in the description box. Quote, Carati was first accused of sexual abuse in 2009, when 14 Italians reported that they had been abused by priests, religious brothers, and other adults at the Provolo Institute in Verona, during a period of time spanning several decades. After an investigation, 5 priests were sanctioned by the Vatican. Carati, then living in Argentina, was among those accused of abuse, but was not arrested or otherwise sanctioned. Pope Francis was notified directly of the allegations against Carati in 2014, when former students of the school wrote to him and Verona's bishop, expressing concern that Carati was living in Argentina and apparently still in priestly ministry. They reportedly got no response from the Pope, but they did receive a limited response from the Vatican. According to the Associated Press, Vatican official Archbishop Giovanni Beccio wrote to the group in 2016, saying that he had referred their request for an investigation to the Italian Bishops' Conference. In the same year, Carati and others were arrested on the charges of sexual abuse made against them in Argentina. Pornographic videos and magazines, along with $34,000 in cash, were found in Carati's room at the time he was arrested, according to the Associated Press. End quote. So we have another case where allegations of sexual abuse were made in 2009 while Carati was living in Argentina. You would think that the ranking cardinal of the Argentinian Bishops' Conference would be aware of these kinds of allegations, right? Is it safe to presume that Cardinal Bergoglio covered up this abuse case like he is alleged to have done with others in Argentina? And speaking of Argentinian cover-ups, new evidence has emerged that Pope Francis, as Supreme Pontiff, ignored the evidence against Bishop Zanchetta of Argentina and created a position for him in Rome. Gustavo Zanchetta was accused not only of having obscene Sodom and Gomorrah porn on his cell phone, but of the sexual harassment of seminarians, and of theft of church property by failure to properly register the sale of an important property of the diocese, as well as poor management of both finances and personnel in Oran, Argentina. Good times. The position that Francis had created for him in Rome is an otherwise meaningless job that did not even exist prior to Francis creating it out of thin air for Zancada. It's something called the assessor to the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. I'm a public administration political science guy, and I frankly haven't any idea what that's about. I suspect that it doesn't do anything. After all, the position was created out of thin air for a bishop of the church credibly accused of sexual harassment and possessing of explicit Sodom and Gomorrah porn. The creation of this post for Zancada begs a lot of questions itself. First among them, why would Francis whisk Zancada out of Argentina to Rome while investigations were ramping up? Another question that comes to mind is this: why hasn't Pope Francis returned to Argentina? He is the first of the conciliar popes to not travel to his homeland. Given that John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, and John Paul the 1st were all Italians, they don't really count. But John Paul II famously visited Poland early in his papacy, and Benedict XVI had made trips to Germany as well. But Francis, now entering year 6 of his pontificate, has never returned to Argentina. He has traveled numerous times to South America, but not to his homeland. That's kind of weird, isn't it? A normal person would, given the chance, visit their homeland if they found themselves in a similar position as the Pope. The answer to that question might be obvious. Investigations are ramping up in Argentina into those close to him, whether it's the people mentioned in this video or in the Natasha Jait case I covered on Monday. The problem with not returning to Argentina is that people eventually begin to notice, like I have, like others have, and like law enforcement eventually will. I'm not going to pretend that any law enforcement agency in the world will try to go after the Pope, even if he is somehow implicated in criminal activity, unless that activity is so beyond the pale and unequivocally and overtly evil that they have no choice but to act. But the possibilities of that are, at this time, remote. But sadly, nothing surprises me anymore. Does anything involving the papacy surprise you? Let me know in the comments below. I can't be the only one who is a bit jaded by all the bad news. And if you think I should cover some good news, send me examples of good news in the church. My email is in the description box below the video screen. It's been a long time since I've had a legitimately good news story, especially related to the crisis in the church, so send me something. If it's relevant, I'll happily do a video on it. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the church. I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.